Hi, this is Diane Steepro from Jeffersonville Township Public Library. I'd like to go over a brief history of Indiana poetry with you today. This is not a complete poetry history for Indiana. It's sort of a irregular overview. I picked poems that I thought were interesting and would be interesting to my audience. We're here in southern Indiana, just above Louisville, and so I try to concentrate on the southern half of the state for the most part. Um, Most people think poetry is dead. That is definitely not the case. There are more places to publish poetry and read poetry than ever before. Poetry has a larger audience than ever before. And there are plenty of places where you can go and even have a poetry slam duel with another person. Um, it's becoming popular among many young people and has been for some time. I don't think there's any danger it's going to die off. Abraham Lincoln, one fellow that has lived in Indiana, has said that every lawyer should read poetry in order to understand the writings of lawyers better, and I think there's some truth to that. Any sort of reading comprehension uh, for any type of work is going to be um, improved by struggling with poetry, by embracing those challenges. And yeah, it's not always easy. Sometimes it is. One time when it's almost always easy is with James Whitcomb Riley. His poems were pretty folksy and accessible. He was a pretty serious alcoholic, but he was also a person who cared about others. He was a person who was involved in some of the social movements of his time, and he had many friends among progressives in this area, such as Eugene Debs. He was the nation's most popular poet around from 1880 until his death in 1960. Um, I don't really know if there was ever anybody who spoke like the characters that he writes. I grew up in rural Indiana in a town with plenty of outhouses still, and I didn't know anybody that talked like this, even though I knew quite a few people that would have whose lifetimes would have overlapped his. But maybe there are. Um, I'm going to give you just a very brief snippet of a poem that you've probably heard because it was set to music. When the frost is on the punkin, and that's his spelling, punkin, and the fodder's in the shock, and you hear the kyak and the gobble of the struttin' turkey cock, and the clackin' of the guineas, and the cluckin' of the hens. And you'd probably have heard the rest. It became pretty popular as a song accompanied by fiddle playing. You may not have heard of feminist Sarah Bolton, but you probably know one line of her poetry. Sarah Bolton was born in 1814 in Madison, so her life roughly overlapped Riley's, although she was a bit older. She spent most of her life in Indiana, but her first husband was a diplomat, so she lived in Switzerland for a while. She was very independent, although, like most poets, socially active. Um, you probably know one of her poems. At least you've heard the first line and the last line, Paddle Your Own Canoe. It's also the title. Here's a snippet of that poem. Nothing great is lightly won, nothing won is lost. Every good deed nobly done will repay the cost. Leave to heaven in humble trust all you will to do. But if you succeed, you must paddle your own canoe. I don't know what all of the commas in the middle of the lines are for. They mark a bit of a pause, but they aren't really grammatical. It's kind of unusual, but paddle your own canoe in some circles still means behave independently. And I think she's still very interesting. And I think that many of the members of my audience will be interested in Elizabeth Conwell Wilson, whose brother-in-law was Governor of Kentucky much after her death. Um, she was born in Laurel, Indiana in 1842 and moved to this place called New Albany, Indiana. While she was there, she met her husband, Forsyth Byron Wilson, a poetic name. If there ever was one, you might be familiar with the British poet Byron. Um, She died from complications of childbirth at 22 and left behind a small collection of poems. They are still in circulation, although a bit difficult to find. If you'd like to read her work, there's a bit in A Hoosier Year of 366 Writers and Speakers, which you can Google, and it will show up as a Google book and can be read online. And here's her poem, April 29th. By his song of faithful love, and by the whispering leaves above, I knew the robin was my friend. Pretty simple little poem, but she was only 22 when she passed, and she was pregnant then. So most poets don't do much work until they are much older, and I think that that's a pretty impressive record. And it's very nice that New Albany has a poet to claim as their own. The next poet I'd like to look at is her husband, Forsyth Byron Wilson. And Forsyth was renowned on his own, although he also died too young to get a whole lot done. He was a little older than her in the beginning. Born in 1837, he died in 1867. So both young people were gone very shortly thereafter the Civil War. He was responsible for helping with the upbringing of his orphaned younger brother, Governor August Wilson of Kentucky. He spent a good deal of his life in the East Coast, although he was born in Kentucky and lived in New Albany. Here's a sample of his poem, The Old Sergeant, a dramatic monologue spoken by a Union soldier, as you would expect from somebody who was friends with Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott, all of whom were strong anti-slavery activists and Union supporters, and pretty radical in their beliefs about slavery and freedom and African Americans. He too followed suit there. I should tell you that this is a dramatic monologue. So it's spoken by a Union soldier who is reporting about the death of an older soldier. And so here it is. The soldier says, "Tell him his old father blessed him as he never did before, and to carry that old musket, hearken, knock is at the door, till the Union. See it, it opens. Father, father, speak once more. Bless you," gasped the old gray sergeant, and he lay and said no more. So the old sergeant blesses his child as he passes. African American poet Mari Evans, her life comes very close to overlapping with Riley. And she lived most of her long life in Indiana. You can see she lived from 1919 to 2017, so approximately 98 years. She was active in the civil rights movement, and many of her poems reflect that. One of her most famous is an unusual poem in that it's about an abstract idea. Most poems are not about an abstract idea, but If There Be Sorrow is about reasons that she feels it's acceptable to be sorrowful. And she gives a list of things that it's acceptable to sorrow over. If there be sorrow, let it be for things undone, undreamed, unrealized, unattained. To these add one, love withheld, restrained. So it is basically a list of 5 things that she believes it's acceptable to sorrow over. And she was a person who did things, dreamed things, realized things, attained things, and loved. So probably the reason for her long life is she got stuff done. Another Indiana poet who moved here later is Etheridge Knight. He was born in Mississippi and raised in Kentucky. He was a veteran of the Korean War, but made his home in Indianapolis during the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. While he was a soldier, he became addicted to painkillers. He was very severely injured, and as you know, uh, they gave some pretty strong painkillers back then without much hesitation. And quite a few soldiers came home with problems from the wars of the early 20th century. He had a few run-ins with the law before he got his life straightened out and became a writer while he was in prison. Quite a tradition of Indiana prison writing, although we're not going to have time for that. But we'll look at his. He went on to be a beloved teacher and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's known for his emotional poetry, and that's often seen as a balance against what most people did at the time, which was really intellectual, inaccessible poetry. So most of his peers were writing things that you had to have a PhD to understand just about, but he uses a lot of simple words. He's funny about capitalizing, as many people were at the time. But there are hardly any 2 and 3 syllable words at all in this little selection. I think his name might be the longest word. Light strike the cave of sleep. I alone tread the red circle and twist the space with speech. Come now, Etheridge, don't be a savior. Take your words and scrape the sky. Shake rain on the desert. Sprinkle. So even though it's emotional, there you may still have to grapple with it and see the whole poem to get it. You can see you don't have to go look up any of those words. You know them. It's a simpler kind of poetry than was common at the time. Now, Yusef Komunyakaa is still teaching in New York. He was born in 1941. He was born in Louisiana. He moved here to teach at Indiana University, where he taught until he became so famous that he had places, colleges all over the world trying to get him to work for them, and he finally took a better offer and moved away from IU. But while he was here, he wrote what is probably his most famous work, Dinky Dow, and he wrote that while I was his student, and it was pretty exciting to watch that come together. It recounts many of his experiences when he served in Vietnam. I will warn you, this is not the most pleasant poem, but it's beautiful in its way, but it's about something horrible, what I'm going to read to you, as you would expect war poems to be. They are about the horrors of war, just trying to put that in words, trying to make pictures out of words, and then make people understand what it is to be a soldier. Neon Vernacular, a later book of his, won the Pulitzer Prize, and his work is very influenced by jazz. Another past Indiana resident and poet, and my classmate, Sasha Feinstein, who is also a jazz musician, edited a series of poetry anthologies or collections with Yusef, and they all contain jazz-influenced poetry. I believe the collection is called the Jazz Poetry Anthologies 1 and 2. The next slide contains his poem, You and I Are Disappearing, and he borrowed the title. So he gives credit to the fellow from whom he borrowed it, and it recounts the speaker of the poem, who is a made-up person, not exactly Yusef, seeing a girl burned to death in Vietnam, as many soldiers did. The cry I bring down from the hills belongs to a girl still burning inside my head. And you know, still burning, it's the speaker's got this stuck in his head. At daybreak, she burns like a piece of paper. She burns like foxfire in a thigh-shaped valley. A skirt of flames dances around her at dusk. We stand with our hands hanging at her sides while she burns like a sack of dry ice. She burns like oil on water. She burns like a cattail torch dipped in gasoline. She glows like the fat tip of a banker's cigar, silent as quicksilver, a tiger under a rainbow at nightfall. She burns like a shot glass of vodka. She burns like a field of poppies, the edge of a rainforest. She rises like dragon smoke to my nostrils. She burns like a burning bush driven by a god-awful wind. It's a really interesting technique for a poem, one which you didn't see much of, but it works really well for this. The poet is essentially saying, this thing is so hard to describe, I can't give you one image that describes it. I'm going to give you a bunch, and all together, cumulatively, these different pictures describe it. Oil on water, a cattail torch, a skirt of flames. Which one of these images really shows what's happening? Well, none of them. And you notice the turn to the soldiers. They stand with their hands hanging at their sides while she burns. They're helpless. It's really a affecting poem. Adrian Meteka, I'm not sure I'm saying his name right, but he is a recent poet laureate of Indiana. Adrian teaches at Indiana University Bloomington, like Yusef did. In fact, I think that's kind of a theme with recent poets. Most of them teach in order to come up with the money to write their poetry. Sorry about the chimes from my equipment. We'll get that to stop in a second. Okay, there we go. That's better. Adrian was a Pulitzer Prize winning finalist. He didn't win the prize, but he was a finalist, and he was a finalist for the National Book Award. And he's quite young. I don't know his exact birth date. It's a little harder with living people to get that kind of information if they aren't putting it out. But he has been quite an asset for Indiana. He was born in Germany, but spent most of his life in Indiana. I believe he was educated in Indiana and Illinois. So he's a real Midwesterner. And this is called The Explorer. And it's a poem in which the speaker is once again giving a dramatic monologue where this is a child telling about doing something that child shouldn't have done and maybe is a little disturbed by. It's a very accessible poem, and I thought you all might enjoy it. The Explorer. I lied when Papa asked, but I'll admit it now, I did touch the blue egg to see if somehow it felt as much like the sky as it looked. The egg, speckled in its twiggy nest, eye level to 8-year-olds, perfect and off limits like the boating balls on Papa's desk. We tried to find its mom, but the finches scattered when we came near. One twittered the alarm from a maple. Others balanced on wires, flapped wings at us like we were gravity. I can still see how carefully Garrett scooped the egg from the nest, then headed out to find a spot on the March concrete to drop it. I want to see if these things break into pieces or in half like on TV. Always the follower, I followed him through the maples, out into the treeless street, my stomach dropping before the egg did. A crunch and then no more. And I'd like to end with Jared Carter. Jared is possibly the most Hoosier of all poets since Riley. He was born in Indiana. He's lived here his entire life. It was not uncommon for him to hang around Knox County when I was younger because he was interested in the history of Indiana and the many things that were there in Knox County where the first state territorial capital was. And I know he's spent time in Harrison County too, just hanging around. He never lived there, but he lived in Indiana, around and about, and visited other places, poked around, as poets will, to find subjects for his writing. He is a descendant of abolitionists who moved here in the territorial times. He often writes about his ancestors. His other topics include moments in Indiana history, geodes, chickens, peony farming, and all things Indiana. And he is a winner of the 1980 Walt Whitman Award. And here's my favorite Indiana poem of all, and it is by Jared Carter, Early Morning. Familiar little phrase for us, early morning. When the weather turned, crows settled about the house, cawing day long among the new leaves. It would be a hard spring, folks said. The crows, they know. There are folks up near where I come from, in Missinawa County, who study such things. Folks who believe tornadoes are alive, that polluted streams rise from their beds like lepers following after some great churning, twisting cloud. With their own eyes, they've seen a cyclone stop, lap up electricity from a substation, then make a right-angle turn and peel the roof off some prefabricated egg factory. Thousands of hens who've never seen the light of the sun or touched earth with their beaks go up the funnel like souls to God. Thank you very much, and if you're interested, there will be another video out shortly. And that will also treat Indiana poetry, but in this case, I don't have any biographical details about the poets. I'm just going to read the poems. Thank you very much, and you all have a safe spring.